But I think I really have to start off by talking to you about the state of the job market as is today. So let's start off by quickly defining these three categories here. So when I talk about an active job seeker, I'm referring to somebody that is going out of their way to look for a new job. They are doing Google searches for jobs. They are going onto job boards. They are actively seeking out recruiters. They are applying for jobs that are advertised online and in written press. Whereas a passive job seeker, that's somebody who is amenable potentially to the idea of moving jobs, but really something's got to pique their interest for them to do that. And they're certainly not going to go out of their way to look for a new opportunity. And then that leaves us with inactive job seekers. So people, whether incredibly happy or simply just because they're not interested in the upheaval, are almost as good as closed to the idea of leaving their current job. Now, this is deliberately being presented as something as a scale rather than, for example, a pie chart, because I think that there are degrees of each of these statuses. For example, at the most extreme, an active job seeker will be speaking potentially to several different recruiters, applying for anything and everything. Whereas another active job seeker might only be speaking to a single job seeker and applying more selectively. And I think it's important to make that point because actually the idea that 20% of all lawyers are active job seekers might sound a lot, but the reality is 20% of all lawyers are not scrambling around the internet, desperately looking for a new job and throwing themselves at the first thing that comes along. And before I can shed any meaningful light on why the state of the market is as is, I think we maybe need to go back and look at historical data. So pre-pandemic, we'd run similar research for the 2 years prior, I think. We started in 2018 and we ran it again in 2019. And both of those years, this was the picture. We had 40% active and only 20% inactive. And I have to say, and I expect you experienced the same, even then it was tough to recruit. It wasn't an easy gig getting good people. And I think I can give probably two simple explanations for why that was. I think a large proportion of active candidates tend not necessarily to be the sorts of candidates that most law firms want to hire. And the second thing being, when you take out of the mix those active candidates, there were more jobs available than there were suitably qualified active, passive or inactive candidates that law firms wanted to consider. So if you were posting job adverts on your careers page or online job boards, and that wasn't necessarily producing the results consistently for you then I can certainly imagine that if you're doing those sorts of things now, you're not going to be having much luck. This state of the market piece shifted last year. It was at the height of the pandemic, so summer 2020, or at least the first wave of the pandemic, when this group of active job seekers halved and the percentage of inactive job seekers doubled. And I think that's probably a response to the uncertainty at the time, the economic situation as it looked then. People tend not to want to leave stable employment amidst the recession for obvious reasons. And that's reinforced by the data that we've got around how people, and you can see the picture slightly different. The vast majority of people last year had concerns about the security of their job. And I think that feeds into why the number of active job seekers halved and all of a sudden those that were firmly inactive doubled. But this picture has changed this year. There's a lot more confidence, and yet the percentages of those identifying as active, passive and inactive hasn't actually changed. And actually, I think, by the way, we can look at the fact that people aren't as concerned about job security, maybe in two ways. Number one being your staff don't necessarily need to look elsewhere for a safe haven and a comfortable staying put, which might be good news. But the other point is actually they might not be too concerned about changing roles should a better opportunity present itself, because that whole last one in, first one out fear is largely lifted. We need to look at engagement levels. And I think this data is interesting here because there's a dichotomy between engagement levels and job seeker status. This shows an awful lot of people engaged in their job at the moment. But this suggests that obviously not all those that are engaged, or rather that aren't engaged, so those in the disengaged or actively disengaged category, are looking for a new role, because that accounts for 42% of the profession, and we know that only 20% are identifying themselves as active job seekers. And equally, we know that not all those who are engaged are necessarily close to the idea of moving, because only 40% are saying they're firmly inactive, and we know that passive job seekers will move. So actually, we could probably infer that there's a chunk of passive and potentially even some inactive job seekers who, if approached in the right way with the right thing, might actually be up for moving. But I do think this data backs up a narrative that we've seen play out over the last 14 to 15 months. And I'll run through that quickly. So, but at the back end of last year, the demand to recruit quickly and heavily against the backdrop of quite a few law firms making redundancies at the height of the first wave of the recession, pandemic and the recession, the demand quickly and heavily returned. And according to our research, in that first wave, not all that many lawyers felt that their employers looked after them as well as they wanted them to. So this fueled an awful lot of recruitment at the back end of 2020 and into the early part of this year. Demand soared, and actually there were a good number of people up for leaving in between these two pieces of research that we did. And so in reality, in a short space of time, many of those lawyers who had perhaps transitioned from being inactive or passive to active job seekers over the course of the back end of 2020, they moved jobs. They were sorted. But the economy was still making positive noises, and demand from clients of law firms was still there, if not growing, as 2021 dawned. And so law firms wanted to carry on recruiting. And I think the more savvy law firms realized that they need to fight a bit harder than usual. They need to fight a bit harder in order to get the good active candidates that were still about. But otherwise, that they would need to make sure they were doing enough to pique the interest of the passive or inactive job seekers. And in basic terms, what this meant was paying above market rate salaries, bowing to the demands for flexibility, throwing around bonuses, offering up more benefits, and generally speaking, driving standards up. But then at the same time, there's a response from those law firms whose employees were trying to resign because they'd been made one of these really competitive offers. The lawyers were going in and saying, right, I'm sorry, but I'm off. To which their employers were going, hey, hang on a minute, we're not going down without a fight. And so they'd counter offer, and they'd start throwing a bit of money around, and they'd start bowing to demands for flexibility. And this carries on through spring and summer, and it continues up till today, to be honest. And so this engagement percentage here, I think, reflects the fact that not only have lots of lawyers moved jobs or been made better offers to stay put over the last 12 to 15 months, and so they're happy kind of as they are, but plenty of other lawyers have probably benefited from the rising standards, by which I suppose I mean more money and flexibility, that this whole thing is thrust upon us. So whereas just over 12 months ago, there was a lack of talent on the market owing to fear, I think now there is a lack because those that wanted to move have moved, and the battle over those that aren't desperate to move, but will if sufficiently incentivized, has pushed standards up for many. So let's just suppose for 1 minute, we can assume that 20%, the 20% who are active are probably not the sorts of people that law firms are wanting to hire into their businesses. What you're left with is a chunk of people, 80%, who are either apparently closed to the idea of a move or aren't up for going out of their way to make a move happen. And of that group, the vast majority are actively engaged in what they're doing or the firm they work for. So I think against this whole backdrop, there are a few takeaways that I would try and suggest thus far. I think the people that you want to join your businesses generally need to be approached in such a way that makes it clear to them that there's really potentially something in it for them to warrant them even taking the time to consider the opportunity when they're comfortable as they are. And they need to feel that the person approaching them is credible and trustworthy and not just trying to shoehorn them into a job to make some money. And that requires plenty of time to nurture the relationships. It requires proactivity to not only approach a high enough proportion of that 80% in order to pique the interest of those that the opportunity could be a good fit for, but each approach has to be tailored, carefully thought through, and takes a lot more time than, hi, I've got this great job for you. And it's got to be crystal clear at the outset, really crystal clear what's in it for them. So the old methods, I just don't think can be relied on as well anymore. When I talk about the old methods, the first thing that comes to mind is adverts. Disclaimer, we use adverts here at Realm. The way we use them is slightly different to the way I think law firms will use them, because there's all sorts of technical information and data which we can pull from the adverts we post. But if I'm speaking traditionally about the way law firms post adverts on their careers pages or on third-party job boards, I just don't see them working anymore. Aside from the fact that there aren't huge waves of lawyers surfing the internet in search of a new job, and so those adverts by definition aren't really getting the views you would like. I find it worrying still, the number of adverts that I read that are put out directly by law firms along the lines of, you will be this, you will be that, we want this, we want that. And I'm a good 30 seconds into reading the advert before there's any meaningful reference to what's in it for me. Sarah, as a marketing professional, will know better than I the average amount of time that someone spends on a web page before their attention is dragged elsewhere. But I can tell you this with certainty, you've not got 30 seconds to grab their attention. Sadly, I even see job adverts on third-party job boards put there by law firms that are 2 or 3 sentences long, and then will say something like, please visit our website for more information. Passive inactive job seekers probably aren't seeing these adverts in the first place. And if they are, I don't think there's enough in it for them to make that effort to go and look. The other thing that I think fits into that traditional way of working that I think is flawed is the PSL model, the preferred supplier list. And I think the easiest way I can convey this is by painting a bit of a flippant picture. But let's suppose there's a law firm A. They will have a preferred supplier list of, say, 10 recruiters. And each time they have a new need to recruit, they fire an automatic email out to those 10 recruiters. Those 10 individual recruiters, knowing that that's as much information as they're going to get, they're not each going to get half an hour to an hour of the hiring manager's time to understand what they're looking for, why they're looking for, and all the backdrop. And knowing that there are 9 other recruiters on it, and knowing that it's a first past the post system, only the successful recruiter gets paid, we'll sit there and we'll have to make a kind of risk-reward assessment. And I imagine as a result of that, you'll quickly get 2, 3, if not 4 recruiters that go, do you know what? I'm too busy. I've got too much else on. Forget it. Of those that are left, you probably get 3, 4 maybe that make a kind of half-hearted attempt to do something. They'll get an advert up and post it. I think I'll see what comes of that. I'll share something on LinkedIn that I've got a new opportunity. I'll call the first 5 people that come to mind that might be suitable, but that's me, then I'm done. I can't afford to put any more time into this. It's too much of a risk. And then you might get, 2 or 3 that for whatever reason decide to crack on and maybe put a bit more time and effort into it. But you can see already, the idea that I've got 10 people out there in the market voicing on my behalf, looking for something. Well, the reality is to the contrary, you really haven't. Those that are left doing it, they will also know that it's a first past the post system. And as much as they'll be putting a bit more effort into it, the manner of their approaches, because they know they've got a rush to beat the other recruiters to it, probably are not as good as they could be if they were given the time and space to properly go and pitch the role to people. And so actually what you end up with is the same lawyers, because there are only a finite number of lawyers that are suitable for any given role, approached by multiple people, but not approached by any of those people in the right way, not in a way that prompts enough interest and piques their interest and makes it worth their while having a meaningful discussion. If law firm A is lucky It might pick up some CVs this way. It really depends on the practice area, the level of role. If not, their response might be to say, right, well, let's go to tier 2 of the preferred supplier list. We've got another 5 or 10 recruiters that we can get on the case. And the same thing happens again. And before you know it, the role has been out there in the ether for so long that everybody that's approached by it has heard about it several times over and is going, there's something wrong with that role. I've heard about it too much. So what do you do instead? Well, I suggest you find a recruiter or a small handful of recruiters who are specialists and or capable of going about approaching people in this proactive, structured, tailored way that I'm setting out, that is necessary to attract and pique the attention of passive and inactive job seekers. You need a skilled recruiter who knows how to tap into these markets. I think a pedigree or some sort of track record of recruiting the sort of people you're after is a good sign, but I don't think that in itself is a guarantee. I think just as important is a thorough understanding of this backdrop and an understanding of how to overcome it. And I say that because a recruiter might have successfully recruited, let's say, for example, injury lawyers for 10 years prior to the pandemic, and they might look great on paper, but in that period, they might have been able to rely heavily on job adverts or the buoyancy of the candidate side of the market. And now they might just not know how to grapple with this fact that most people are passive and inactive. And all of a sudden, they're blunt. So yes, I think if you're looking for recruiters, ask about track record, look for evidence that they've done the thing before that you're wanting them to do. But I think just as important is to ask for their appraisal of the market, see whether they understand what it looks like, why it looks as it does, and make sure they can credibly explain how it is that their approach can overcome it. Got a couple of questions that have come up that I'm just going to kind of go to before I carry on. My manager wants me to expand the PSL. Should I not, based on your advice? That is a big question, and my suggestion would be no. And I hope you'll forgive me if I ask Sarah to make a note of that, and I'll come back to it in more detail at the end. And actually, the other question that I've just seen pop up is to do with internal referral schemes, and I think probably that's not pertinent at this point. So, Sarah, could I remind you to ask me on that again at the end too? So, find a skilled recruiter or recruiters. 2, partner with them. This flippant example I've given of the PSL and how that works is the opposite to partnering with a recruiter. You're keeping them at arm's length like a supplier. Partnering with them could mean giving them exclusivity. It doesn't necessarily have to. It could mean working with 2, 3, possibly 4 recruiters, but with each of them, properly partnering them would mean opening your doors up to them, putting in quality time with them up front so that they understand not just what you're looking for, but why you're looking for it and what it is that you can offer in order to attract the sort of people that you're after. It means letting them speak to the hiring managers and partners in your business to properly get to know what they're pitching to the market. It means being open to their feedback and advice, even if sometimes you don't like it, particularly because it might mean that it's going to end up costing you more money to get the thing you want. And I think the other thing here that's possibly the elephant in the room that I would suggest needs to happen against the backdrop of the current market is adjust your expectations a little bit, especially if you've been looking to hire for a role for a long time with little success. And let me give some examples of what I specifically mean by this. Be ready, willing, and prepared to move at a pace that your recruiter advises. Typically, passive and inactive candidates need shorter amounts of time between having their interest piqued and the first conversation that they have with a recruiting firm than an active candidate might. And that's because usually you've got to kind of build their interest up to a point at which they're ready to say, yes, I want to have that conversation. But every day that passes without them having that conversation, their interest will naturally wane again. So you want to keep the momentum going. A 20 to 30 minute informal chat over Zoom or a coffee would probably be enough to kick that process off. So it's not too time consuming or cumbersome for you. At the same time, that passive or inactive job seeker is probably not going to be in a hurry to make a decision. So you may have to elongate your process, which might mean even more interviews, chats, or meets and greets along the way than is normal at shorter intervals in order to keep that momentum going. But I would expect the recruiter that you work with would be able to advise you on the specifics of that based on the candidates that you've got in process. But let me just say that if what you do is say, that's our availability, it's 2 weeks from now, you can like it or lump it. I mean, I'd probably go to that saying, but I think in the context of the current market, that's not going to work. And the other thing that I'd say around expectations is be willing to be as pragmatic as you can be and not too principled about what the right person looks like. I know that in any organization, there are, non-negotiables, things that, any new recruiter's got to have. But I find that most businesses, when they go to market, they set out what the ideal candidate looks like and they search in vain for that ideal. And months of lost fees, lost revenue, and missed opportunities can go by, whilst all the time they could have hired someone who actually has the right values, is the right team fit, meets those non-negotiables, who probably has the necessary skill set to at least do the job to a level. They might not be the ideal candidate, but they're a good candidate. Because actually the number of times we hear, but there must be somebody out there, when the reality is there might be, but that 10 out of 10 candidate is probably in that inactive 40% and just not for moving unless you're willing to move heaven and earth for them. So by all means, set out looking for your ideal. But if your recruiter gives you credible feedback as to why the search is proving difficult, or if you sense that yourself because time is passing and you're not getting the inflow of CVs, be willing to bend, be a bit pragmatic and look how you can achieve your goals in other ways. But if that backdrop isn't challenging enough, we've also got to grapple with the next big piece of the puzzle. Lawyers' priorities. I believe that our research every year puts the multitude of different things that lawyers consider and look for when weighing up job opportunities into about 19 categories. We ask those surveyed to tell us what the relative importance of each category is to them were they to consider moving jobs. And we give them 5 options: very important through to very unimportant. We weight very important the most, followed by fairly important next, and then neither important or non-important, and so on and so forth. And ever since we started this annual research piece back in 2018, money and flexibility have always come out as our top 2. So on the slide in front of you, pay rise, money, one and the same thing. But what's really interesting is this year, it's the first time that flexibility has come out as number 1. So it's been in the top 2 for the last 4 or 5 years, but now it's firmly number 1. And what's also interesting is that at the same time that flexibility has become number 1 and money has actually taken on more significance too, every other category near enough has dropped in relative importance. So I want to pick up on that point about flexibility, and I want to talk through the data on these slides. So what we can see here is that the vast majority of firms on this pie chart on the left are still encouraging home working. And in the middle, we can see that more than half are allowing staff to work the entirety of the working week from home. So there's a lot of flexibility in offer, which is great, because that's what lawyers are wanting. And especially because we can see that 85% of our survey respondents want the option to work 3 days or more from home, as per this pie chart on the right. But here's a question. What if you're part of the 17% that's not encouraging home working? You might well be permitting it, but there's a difference between permitting it and encouraging it. Because if you're not encouraging it, if what you're doing is allowing people to do it, but at the same time encouraging people to come in the office as much as they can, what you're potentially doing is signposting that as soon as you possibly can, you'll make it compulsory for everybody to come into the office as much as possible. Or what if you're in the 20% that's offering 2 days from home or less, when we know that the vast majority want 3 or more. And actually, I saw some data from a separate piece of research that was in the news this morning that says something to the effect that virtual law firms have seen an increase in people joining them of 38%. So it shows, there's lots of data out there that reinforces this point. And actually, the combination of this data and the narrative that we're seeing unfold day to day, I think it empowers me to say with some conviction that flexibility is basically now a prerequisite. It's no longer a benefit. But of course, I know the phrase flexibility in itself is somewhat subjective and can mean different things to different people. So I want to try to illuminate what I think it can mean. To some, I think it means working from home 5 days per week. To others, it means the choice to choose the hours they work regardless of where they're working. And for some, it might mean the flexibility to choose to come into the office 5 days a week if they wish, and perhaps the next week not come in at all. And I think it's really important that we as employers, we keep in mind how potentially varied people's perceptions are of what flexibility is. And let just for a moment that and the fact that I'm telling you that it's a prerequisite now sink in. Because I understand there's a fear of a loss of office culture by virtue of people working remotely more. And I think it's very legitimate. We're grappling with it ourselves at Realm. But whether we like it or not, we are where we are. And ordaining from on high that staff have to be in the office as much as possible because of this fear is, in my humble opinion, counterproductive. We're witnessing on a far too regular basis, in my opinion, otherwise brilliant employers. We're witnessing them lose staff because they won't move with the market on this front. And in my world, the pragmatic course of action would be to offer the flexibility that people are demanding. And in terms of the culture issue, worry about what else we can do to prevent that loss of culture. Because losing staff, because you won't give them the flexibility they want, and then struggling to replace them because of your stance on flexibility is, in my, again, humble opinion, equally bad for culture. I know too that there are concerns around supervision. And I think those are very legitimate too. But again, I'd think more about what you can be doing instead of getting people into the office as much as possible to ensure that they're properly and suitably supervised, rather than fighting against the tide. So I would suggest to ensure you're appealing to at least just a bit more than half the market, I think you need to be looking to offer 3 days from home with flexible hours. Of course, there are plenty of circumstances in which you might legitimately want to offer slightly more or slightly less, but I think that is a good kind of base level to be at. And that brings me to money. Because if I'm saying to you flexibility is now a prerequisite, then that leaves pay as the primary battleground for talent. And this data here suggests 2 things, I think. If you're willing to pay, there are passive and inactive candidates out there to be tempted. I think that's the good news. Because although that makes up 80% of the profession, we're seeing here that 40% don't think they're paid fairly. Even if we think that half of that is made up of those active job seekers, that still leaves a portion who are probably from that passive and inactive category. And we can also see that a large number of people have not had pay increases over the last 12 months. A lot have, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But there's good news there. If you're willing to pay, I think there's an opportunity there for you to attract good talent. But what I would say actually is it might be sensible before you even worry about attracting talent to ensure you've properly reviewed the pay of your existing staff. It's much more cost efficient to keep employees happy than and in that inactive zone than it is to replace them. And I say that especially if you're a client of ours on this webinar, because where we have terms of business signed and in place with you, part of our service pledge says we do not go after the employees of yours proactively. So they'll be safe as far as Realm are concerned. But let me share some anecdotal evidence with you. I asked the team at Realm to provide me with these examples yesterday. And even I was shocked actually when I put all this together. So here are some examples I'm going to give you. We placed a newly qualified employment lawyer this year. They secured a £17,000 pay increase. A 1-year qualified family lawyer got a £10,000 pay increase. A senior associate level of real estate lawyer got a £25,000 increase. A £45,000 pay increase for a family partner. A 10k increase for a junior property damage lawyer. A commercial litigator at about 5 years PQE getting a 12k pay increase. We've had a junior private client lawyer increase their salary by £10,000 purely by staying put and taking a counter offer. We've had a commercial insurance lawyer decline an £18,000 pay increase because they told us that they got more to stay put. And I could go on. I could just go on and on and on. And I think you get the point. But I think that would prompt the question, well, what does competitive look like in this market as far as salary is concerned? Big part of that is relative to practice area in PQE. I suspect a lot of you will have seen our data on that front. If not, we'll send it to you. But I'd like to try and give you something tangible, simple and meaningful that you can take away with you. So here we are, right? Inflation's on the up. I think wage inflation is probably 4%, maybe slightly higher. We suspect passive and inactive candidates who've not yet had pay increases this year will be demanding one, and they'll probably get one, at least in line with inflation. We know that those same people are quite comfortable as they are, so they don't need to move. We know that money is the next most important thing after flexibility. We know that every other category, every other thing that lawyers consider when moving jobs has gone down in relative importance this year. And so what we're left with is the fact that passive and inactive job seekers probably want a financial incentive to justify them leaving the role in which they're quite comfortable. How about if I were to suggest that you need to be offering something in the region of a 10 to 30% pay increase in order to be terming your pay structure competitive when looking to attract new talent? Some of those examples I've given you go above that. I think that's where we're at. But don't let anything I've said around priorities thus far let me make you think that flexibility and money really are the only things worth concerning yourself with. These have taken on more importance at the expense of other things, but the other things are still very relevant. And actually, if we've got 19 categories of different things that lawyers consider when moving jobs, I think it goes without saying no single law firm can score 10 out of 10 on all those fronts. What we advocate trying to do is picking those 3, 4, 5 that you can score 10 out of 10 on and building your employer proposition around those. And if I had more time today, I'd go into those other categories in more depth. But suffice to say, if flexibility is out of the question as part of that proposition, because it's as much as a prerequisite now, any good employee proposition and employer brand needs to hinge on 3 to 5 other categories, in my opinion, and competitive pay has got to be part of that if you're serious about growing and attractive new talent. But one other category that I do want to quickly touch on before we kind of wrap things up: well-being. Sorry, I've gone back a slide, haven't I? This data suggests that more than half of lawyers are at best indifferent to the contribution that their employer makes to safeguarding their mental health and well-being. That's my interpretation. This is a topic that's increasingly been on the agenda in recent years, probably came to the fore, big time, 2015, 2016. But let me suggest that it's no longer enough to just be talking about it. The time for gestures on this front has come and gone. People want action. They want practical, meaningful initiatives. And as more and more law firms, they've realized that and they introduce such measures, let me just say this: it will only serve to unfavorably highlight those that haven't done so. So if this isn't something you've meaningfully grappled with yet, let me suggest that you do so as soon as possible. So when we talk priorities, what are the key takeaways here? Well, I would say know your employees really well is the number one. I know I've not said this up till now, and I've been banging on about the importance of money and flexibility, but actually the thing I'd want you to take away from this, over and above those things, is to know your employees really, really well. Our results are based on a demographic that is loosely representative of the legal profession as a whole. And the results, if you were to run this same research in your firm, they would be reflective of the demographic that you have, and so might look very different. But just a quick word of caution on this. Are you trying to recruit for the firm that you are or want to be? Or rather, are you trying to recruit for the firm that you need to be in order to attract the type of talent you want? I.e., is having an inflexible approach to home working disproportionately affecting your ability to appeal to those who have care responsibilities, leading them to leave or not come to you in the first place? So yes, know your employees well, understand what their priorities are, but also think about not just the firm you are today, but the firm you need to be in order to achieve the goals that you've got for the business. So get stuck into the firm and then think about what are the 3 to 5 things that you're already pretty good at, or that you can and know you should get better at, and get as good as you possibly can on those fronts. And then you've got something to work with then. You've got a proposition. You've got something that you or the recruiters you work with can meaningfully go and lead with when trying to attract the attention of passive and inactive job seekers. There's a clear, this is something in it for me. If I'm a candidate approached with that, it's got to be tangible. So what now? Be sure you're in line with the market when it comes to flexibility. Do something with that 10 to 30% wage increase figure I've mooted, please, if you're serious about growing and attracting good talent. And do more than pay lip service to well-being. So just, I think, to try and summarize, in terms of getting your ducks in a row when it comes to flexibility and pay, if you're not offering 3 days a week from home and flexible hours, you probably aren't keeping up with the general market. If you haven't increased salaries by at least 4% this year, you're likely to be left behind. And if you want to grow and hire good talent, you might need to be prepared to offer increases of 10% or more. And as I've said, we've salary benchmarking data for all key practice areas that you're welcome to get after this webinar. 2, no law firm can score 10 out of 10 across the board, and we don't suggest you try. Decide what you're choosing to major on, whether it be pay, speed of promotion, well-being, etc. Know your employer value proposition and make sure you're communicating it at every opportunity you can. Is it on your website? Is it going out through your social media? Have you ensured the recruiters you work with have a clear sense of it and can confidently and expertly advocate it to candidates on your behalf? And then 3, have a strategy built around that for piquing the interest of passive and inactive candidates. As our data shows, the perception of job security has drastically increased, and the people you want for your business aren't actively looking. Is your HR or internal recruitment team working together with your marketing team to find creative ways to attract talent and not just churning out the sorts of adverts I described earlier on? Are you partnered with a recruiter or recruiters who truly not only understand legal recruitment, but understand this market and how to navigate it? And are you properly communicating your employer brand and proposition? Now, I'm going to quickly get my crystal ball out before we wrap up. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. And actually, when we invited you all to this webinar, the phrase Omicron was not part of my day-to-day vocabulary. Regardless of whether the variant does to the economy what the initial outbreak of the pandemic did or not, I think the confidence of would-be job seekers is likely to drop again anyway. It adds to uncertainty. And I think we could soon be looking at a market where something like only 5 to 10% are active, 30 to 40% passive, and maybe 50 to 60% inactive. So it's going to get tougher. Even putting aside the government advice that we've all received about work from home if you can, the demand for flexibility would probably continue to grow anyway. I refer to not only our research, but the piece of research I saw this morning about the number of people joining virtual law firms to evidence that. I think it's only going to continue to get more difficult, more time consuming, and more expensive to recruit. So I think trying to ensure high retention levels is going to take on more importance than ever before. Something we help our clients with, by the way. And I'm going to be brave here. I'm going to talk about our fee structure and where we're coming from on this. Whilst we've not formally increased our prices this year, we are reviewing the terms we have in place with many of our clients. And in a lot of cases, we're asking for higher rates. I painted this picture of the very flippant PSL model earlier, and I made the point that it's first past the post that wins in contingency recruitment. The amount of time and resource that's required of us to get a good candidate into a role is only growing, and we've got to pay for that somehow. And I suspect many other credible recruiters will be doing the same. Equally, I've said you don't necessarily need to give a recruiter exclusivity, but I would really be prepared for more recruiters asking for it on certain roles, because we certainly are and will continue to do so, because that risk reward thing, it doesn't work out for us if we've got others snapping at our heels. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Sarah and we'll jump into questions.
Thanks very much, Duane. Hopefully everyone can agree that there was some really great tips and advice there in terms of what your strategy might look like for next year. And hopefully some of that data provided some pause for thought. We're going to go over into the Q&A section now. And there was a couple of questions, obviously, that we had during that Duane, you wanted me to come back to. So firstly, I'll come to the one about the expansion of the PSL and whether, so someone has said, my manager wants me to expand the PSL. Should I not, based on the advice that you've given today? And I think you wanted to come back to this in some more detail.
Yeah, I did. I think I said in the moment, probably not. In all seriousness, the answer might be yes, the answer might be no, but I want to kind of flesh that out. Firstly, I need to reference that scenario again, that flippant scenario explained earlier. And I'd ask you to think about what your PSL looks like right now. And I'd ask yourself, am I properly partnering with those recruiters that are already on the PSL? And am I giving them a fair opportunity to help us? If the answer is no, because you keep them at arm's length, you send them a job description, you don't let them get briefed by hiring managers, they've never come into your law firm, then I'd pause for thought and think about whether you can do that with the existing recruiters first. But if the answer is yes, if you're already doing that, I'd probably crack the whip first of all. But if that doesn't work, then I'd absolutely look to bring in new recruiters. But I wouldn't necessarily look to bring new recruiters in addition to those you've already got, but rather instead of. But I think that process just has to start with an honest review of how are we working with our recruiters in the first place? Given all the stuff I've said about the market, are we really empowering them to help us? Those recruiters will know they're not going to get paid unless they're first past the post, and they know this market's tough. And so they'll be making tough decisions every day around where to dedicate their time. And they'll put more time into the roles, the firms, the clients, where they are respected most and partnered with most.
Makes sense. And from an internal process perspective within a law firm, you spoke a little bit earlier about how speedy the process needs to be in order to be piquing the interest of these inactive and passive candidates. What would you recommend in terms of internal processes? Because I know, for example, some law firms will centralise their recruitment within a HR team or a talent acquisition team. Other law firms have a bit more of a flexible approach, and I think partners or heads of division will do the recruitment themselves. Various divisions within a firm might be using a different preferred list of recruiters, and I'm assuming that can slow things down quite a bit. So have you got any advice for firms looking to perhaps review and improve on their internal processes?
I would try to bring everything to the center ground. I think there's a misconception that recruiters that work for consultancies and agencies like Realm dislike internal recruiters and internal HR teams. On the contrary, we don't. We love them because they help us manage the process and manage hiring managers and partners. But what they need to do, what law firms need to do, is bring everything to the middle and make sure everybody knows what's going on, but don't use that as an excuse to not permit external recruiters to speak to internal hiring managers and partners and stakeholders. Don't let that centralization mean that by definition, you keep your recruiters at arm's length. Because actually, I just think you then fall into that PSL trap I've set out, which was probably set up with the best intentions in the world, but over time just stops being as effective. I think another point on process, I'm going to hold my hands up here. It depends on the area of law. It depends on the level of hire. In some cases, you could just get away with one interview and that's that. But in other extremes, you might need 5, 6, or 7. I'm coming at this from this middle ground of what's going to work for most. And I think a first step of an informal conversation between the candidate and probably the hiring manager, assuming the candidate is going to be passive or inactive, is a great way to get things moving and pique their interest.
Yeah, absolutely. The other question we had was around internal referral schemes and whether any of our clients have set these up successfully, because there's a viewer who is thinking of setting one up. Have we got any examples where we know that's worked well?
I'll be honest, no, I don't have any examples. I'm not conscious that any of our clients do this. It's not to say they don't. I'm sure many of them do. But just coming at it from the point, the principle behind it, I would wholeheartedly encourage it. In my mind, a warm introduction to a candidate from one of your current teams is a good introduction. And I suspect the cost associated with making that hire would be less than if you had to hire via a recruiter. So wholeheartedly, I would definitely look at putting something like that in place. It's something that we have at Realm. Yeah,
because lawyers know lawyers, right? So they'll trade with other lawyers, they'll hang out with other lawyers. Yeah, absolutely. We've had another question from Mark. He has asked, are candidates expecting formal, flexible working contracts, or is the current practice to work on the basis of non-contractual staff handbooks provided for remote working? So a candidate's looking for flexibility written into their contracts, or is it done on a bit more of an informal basis?
To my mind, it's the latter, it's the informal basis. But what I think they want or they prefer is a clear blanket policy for everybody so that they know everybody's got the same terms. We've had some clients manage to successfully recruit where they've said, look, we'll offer flexibility, but we want to negotiate it person to person. But generally, I think that's more difficult than just saying, right, this is our flexible working policy. It applies to everybody. Because that way, if you think about it, when the recruiter's going to the potential candidates, these passive and inactive people, to be able to say the flexible working policy is this, offers them a bit more certainty than, well, what they will do is offer flexibility. We don't know what that's going to look like for you, though. You'd have to come to the table first and talk about it. But I don't think any of it needs to be formally written into contracts, no.
Yeah. And I think just, when I'm sat in office and I can hear the conversations that our advisors are having with candidates, it's always a question that is asked about the flexibility. And, sometimes if we have to say, oh, well, it's basically given to the head of division to decide that and something you have to talk about, you can tell it's just not as strong a proposition in the candidate's eyes. So yeah, that's brilliant. And another question from Mark, are you finding that those who are working remotely are open to performance management? And if so, do you have any specific examples of the types of targets, benchmarks, expectations that candidates are prepared to tolerate and accept? So I think this very much applies to, so if we're offering this flexibility, how do we manage it within the firm?
I think there's maybe a few parts to this answer. The first part is, I could probably go away and dig up some more, time sensitive, well thought through research on this point. But I think the bigger point here is that, to me, it's somewhat unwritten that the more flexibility somebody's given, the more trust that's being placed in them, and therefore the more accountable by definition they've got to be to metrics. What those metrics should look like, well, I don't think any two businesses are the same. So I think so long as they are made clear up front to the individual and explained, the why behind it explained, I don't really see that any reasonable individual ought to have a problem with them.